In the mid 1980s, game developers had started to shift away from making games about invaders from space and intergalactic battles and such like, and started making games more focused on earthbound combat, and so Konami produced this game, which is Green Beret, or Rush and Attack as it was called in North America. The title, Rush and Attack, is a shortened version of Rush and Attack, so that it sounds more like Russian Attack, which explains the setting for this Cold War run and gun. In fact, run and gun is not even an accurate description, as the player is only equipped with a knife, so this is a run and stab game, really. The player assumes the role of a US Special Forces operative or Green Beret, and is tasked with infiltrating an enemy base to save POWs from execution by firing squad. The action is set over several different stages, and at the end of each level, the player gets caught in an ambush scenario, which serves as an end of level challenge. To make the challenge a little easier, the player can pick up weapons such as a flamethrower, bazooka, and grenades. And these do come in handy, as at times it seems like the player can get a little overwhelmed with all the various different enemy types flying around the screen. At the time of its release, arcade games were still very basic, and didn't require the need for a good story or even a track sequence to draw the player in, and so the title page looked bland and uninviting. This was especially common among Konami games at the time, as the title pages were just that. You got the title of the game and some point scoring information, and that's it. But this was the mid 1980s, and most kids were not concerned with any of that stuff. All they seen was a game that looked like a lot of fun and was something new to waste their money on. My local chip shop had this game to replace the awful Yar Kung Fu, and that fact alone made me happy. So I was only too eager to put in my 20p and have a go, and when I did, I was surprised. Surprised at how difficult the game was. Up to this point in my video game playing life, these types of games gave you a gun, so you could just run about and shoot constantly. In Green Beret, you had to wait to see the whites of the eyes, or in this case, the whites of the pixel blob that represented the enemy's hand, before you could dispose of the enemy. I had never played a game where you had to wait till the last minute before you could see off an enemy, and the enemies came in front and from behind, so you had to be careful when attacking. Each time you use your knife, the player stops, and this allows the enemy soldiers to get close to you, and so at some point you have to deal with the enemies from behind as well. This was a great game to play. I enjoyed playing it a lot, and would regularly have a go with my schoolmates and challenge each other to see who could get the furthest. None of us were ever any good at it, but that didn't dampen the fun factor of this great little game. The sounds are really standard fare. In 1985, very few developers were concerned with good tunes or decent sound effects. Everything here is functional. The background music is the same throughout the entire game, and all the sound effects do sound very computerized. Visually, this is not the best looking game around, even for 1985. Some of the colour choices are poor, and in the levels where the backgrounds are meant to be snowy looking, it creates this colour clash, making it a little difficult to see the enemies advancing towards you. The sprites are small and not very well animated, and at times the collision detection seems just a little off. I remember thinking to myself that the Commodore 64 would have no problem in converting this at all. Imagine snapped up the rights to the game from Konami, and they produced a fairly decent port of the game, if I am being totally honest. At this time in the life of the Commodore 64, a few arcade games were faithfully ported over to the little 8-bit home micro, and I remember getting this game and being impressed with the visuals, and thought they'd done a good job of representing the arcade original. In fact, due to the limited colour palette of the Commodore 64, the use of colours actually eliminated a lot of the colour clashes from the arcade. All of the characters had this funny kind of bouncy strut, like they'd been walking on hot coals, or maybe even had a marble or two in their shoe. At the time, I thought it looked pretty cool. Sonically, the game wasn't up to much at all. The soundtrack was pretty close to the arcade, but the sound of the stabbing sounded like someone sucking up the last few drops of a McDonald's milkshake through a straw. The gameplay was pretty much spot on to the arcade. It was a simple game to port, I guess, as the arcade original wasn't exactly a groundbreaker. Simple play mechanics and simple controls. The only downside, as was now becoming more of a problem, was that the arcade had 2 buttons, the C64 only had 1. And so to use the flamethrower, you had to use the spacebar on the keyboard. When I played it at home on a Commodore 64, a mate of mine would often man the keyboard and use the flamethrower whenever it looked like I needed to use it, and I would return the favour when giving him a go. Reviews in magazines were mostly favourable, although one magazine cited it as an incredibly violent game, which I disagree with entirely. Computer and Video Games magazine said it was a terribly addictive game, and it was. At times, it felt like for a long while it was the only game I was playing on the Commodore 64. Sadly, game ports as good as this were starting to become very rare. And this game, along with Commando, made me start to realise that I would need to be replacing my home computer every so often if I wanted to keep playing the latest and greatest games. A life lesson that was learned very early on in life. In closing, Green Beret was one of my all-time favourite games on a Commodore 64, and in my opinion is a true classic in every sense of the word. It was ported over to just about every home format at the time, and I encourage you to check out the arcade version if you haven't already. If you like this video, then please do give me a sub and a thumbs up, or maybe even a comment or two below. That's all from me, folks. Thanks for watching.